Iben Thranholm, welcome to the Herland Report. You are a feared Danish theologian and a free thinker, which is something that is rare to find in Europe and in the West nowadays. People who actually dare to be critical and pose critical questions to power, like Michel Foucault so famously stated in Fearless Speech, the need to do that. But you are a free-spirited person, and you are something as strange as a Christian in Europe, and a proud one, just like myself. And it's strange because we live in quite an authoritarian, anti-Christian structure in the West, in which we've had elites that for several decades now have tried to demonize the Christian faith. Here in Norway, we even have ministers who have worn the cross, just, you know, as a beautiful sign. And then there's like an immediate angry mob in the mainstream media stating, you know, one is supposed to leave the religion back in some cold room and never show any sign of religious affiliation. So we live almost in a state of persecution, a Christophobia in the West. But you have been to Russia, haven't you? Can you tell us about that?
It was in 2014. I decided I wanted to go to Moscow myself just to do some research, because I have been reading about how Christianity was reviving after the collapse of communism. And the case that really got me interested in Russia was the Pussy Riot's case. I don't know if you remember it. The female punk band who went into a huge cathedral in Moscow, and they performed a punk song in front of the altar, the holy altar, where they were asking the Virgin Mary to put Putin down. And they was condemned, and they got, I think it was a couple of months or some years in jail. People were really outraged in the West, because they thought that Putin was really a very, very despotic, evil leader that allowed no freedom of speech. Whereas the Russians, they saw it differently. The reason why they got convicted was because that they went into a church and they were doing something that was completely blasphemous in a church. So I think it was only like less than 10% that supported the Pussy Riot punk band in Russia, and they all think it was reasonable that they were put to jail because they went into a church. So I realized that this was a people who did not want to compromise their Christian values. So I thought, wow, because in the West, I learned during the Mohammed crisis, which actually started in Denmark, as you know, it was a Danish newspaper that did the cartoons, that we should use our freedom of speech to ridicule religion. We should go against religion. But in Russia, they said, no, we have to protect our Christian values. So when these women go into the church and they desecrate the church, of course, they should be convicted and put to jail. So I thought, wow, I thought this was really something extraordinary. And then I read about Putin, who was really talking a lot in favor of Christian values. I mean, he gave, at that point, he had given already $100 million to rebuild churches in Moscow. And he gives a lot of speeches in Russia where he talks about the importance of the Christian Russian Orthodox faith, which is never reported in the West. And since I am a theologian, I was paying attention to this. So I thought, okay, this country is really interesting. I want to go and see with my own eyes if it's true or not, if it's just propaganda like everybody else said in the West. And the summer I traveled was when the Ukraine crisis was peaking. So everybody said, don't go. You are insane. What do you want to do in Russia at this moment? I mean, look what they're doing in Ukraine and with the Crimea story and all these things. I said, I don't care. My main concern is not politics. I'm a theologian. I'm a religion reporter. I want to go and see if it's true that the Russian society is a Christian society. And of course, I was a little bit concerned myself, because I still had the Soviet image of that would be microphones in the walls and they would, you know, follow me and you know, just report everything I was doing to some kind of, you know, secret service. But nevertheless, I was there for 14 days, 2 weeks, and I was just astonished. I was overwhelmed to feel something I have never felt before in the Western world, and that was spiritual freedom. The first couple of days, I couldn't figure out what it was, but I felt this kind of light in my soul, or I felt there was some kind of joy in the air. I couldn't describe it. It was really hard for me, but everywhere when I went into churches, I could see they were full of people who were praying and who were worshiping God. Even outside in the street, when young people were passing by a church, they would stop and they would make the sign of the cross in front of the church, in the street. And things I've never seen in the West. There were icons all around. Even at the Red Square, they have put up icons above the gates into Kremlin with St. George and the dragon. And there is this big mall called GUM, where they have all the designer shops. You can get Prada, Christian Dior, they have everything in there. It's very expensive. And above every entrance, they have put a new icon of Christ the Pantocrator or the Mother of God. So before you go and buy your Prada bag, you can say a prayer, you can think about Christ. I mean, that could never happen in Paris or London, never. So I was just really overwhelmed. And I couldn't figure out this kind of a feeling of freedom and joy, I would even say love in the air, because I was told that Russia was such an evil country and nothing good could come from Russia. So I was really overwhelmed. So I went into a church and I was invited by the priest for a lunch, and I talked to a young lady and I said, I tried to explain to her this strange feeling I had, and then she gave me the words. She said, yes, in Russia we have spiritual freedom. Wow. And I knew exactly when she said that this was true. They had a spiritual freedom like we don't have in the West, because now we have what they used to have. I mean, or cultural Marxism is now developing in the West, because I realized that in these 2 weeks when I was in Russia, that when communism collapsed, or the Soviet Union collapsed, communism did not die. I mean, the spirit of communism just was escaping to the West. Or I would say Marxism came from the West. It was never a Russian idea. We have to keep that in mind when we talk about Russia and the Soviet Union. Marxism was imposed by Western philosophers.
Yes, because it's such a great paradox, isn't it? That precisely the kind of state atheism that Russia used to have under the Soviet Union, which broke down, and then they went searching for a new identity. The same kind of state atheism is what we have implemented in the West, and now it's really us. I mean, in the olden days, we used to look at the people living behind the Iron Curtain, as they named it, and we felt sorry for them because they were not free. They were not free to worship. They were not free to believe in religions. They were not free to they didn't have free speech, all these different values. And we felt sorry for them. And yet now we're in that situation. And when we look to Russia, I think over 70% of the Russian population are now believers. And this must be the greatest Christian revival in the modern times, actually, and we hear approximately zero about it in the Western press.
What I realized those first 2 weeks I spent in Russia was that we have swapped roles culturally, morally, and spiritually. So now we are the Soviet Union and they are the free world. And nobody believed me. When I came back and I told people, I wrote a column with the headline, "Moscow is the new Manhattan," because I think that it is the new free world for Christians. So I started to see myself as a Christian dissident, coming from the West, trying to explore this new Christian culture. And I felt like a VIP, because never in my entire life has I felt like I was so right being Christian. And normally I always had to feel wrong that I was Christian, because I was some kind of outcast because I was Christian. Suddenly they treated me with respect, and everybody thought it was really great I was a Christian. I couldn't believe it. It was so overwhelming. It was like I came to the free world again. And when I grew up in Scandinavia during the Cold War, I was very afraid of the Russian invasion. I think everybody here in Scandinavia was. And if somebody had told me in 30 years, you're going to stand on the Red Square and you will feel more free as a Christian than you did when you were a child growing up thinking about how evil the Soviet Union was, I would say, you're kidding me. I mean, I could not even imagine that in my wildest dreams, that we could come to a point, or there could be so many political changes, that I should feel more free as a Christian in Russia than in Denmark. And when I came back from Russia that summer and I told people, they said, no, that's not true. You are lying. Putin paid you to say this. I said, come on. I mean, I paid for this trip myself. I made my research. I'm a journalist. I'm not kidding you. And there was even an editor who said to me, well, I can't really use your research for anything as long as we're talking about Russia. So don't come to me with that. He didn't believe me because he didn't want to change his mind.
But this is also one of the problems and major problems which we regularly discuss here at the Herland Report as well. I mean, it's such a massive problem of the totalitarianism that has entered the Western structures. It's unbelievable when you see the mainstream media, the bias and the one-sidedness that's portrayed the whole time. It's really like the old-time propaganda. So I understand very well why the Danish said, how can there be anything positive about Russia? Because the demonization of Russia is what we're shown and, the whole time in our media as well, which is such a problem, actually. It's strange too, because when you look all over the world, if you go to the Middle East, nobody will respect you if you don't have a faith. If you go to South America, I mean, this is the entry. And like a Muslim friend of mine said once, she says, I would never marry somebody who doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe in Judgment Day. What on earth will he do to me if he doesn't believe that he will be held accountable for his actions? So throughout the world, and now we see China, for example, nearing, I think it is 300 million, or at least over 200 million. Soon China is the largest Christian country in the world. So everyone is a believer, but when you come to Denmark or Norway or the Scandinavian
or any
country,
Western country, any Western country. But I would say that this experience in Russia was extremely overwhelming and fascinating. I was for the first time, I felt this kind of spiritual freedom, as I talked about before. So I have been reflecting a lot upon how come that the West has such a hatred against Russia, because not only did I feel the spiritual freedom, I also saw that Russia was a very peaceful country. They just want to mind their own business and they just want to protect their own borders, but they are not aggressive at all. And now recently when I was there, I talked to some Russians about how they feel about that we say that they want to come and they want to bring war to Europe. And they said, well, we are very sad and we just really hope that somebody will come back to common sense. And we're just waiting for that because we don't understand why you hate us so much. But there were no aggressiveness. They didn't want to, go to war with us. They just was waiting for better times because they just simply don't understand us. So, of course, I've been reflecting a lot about what is it? How come everybody that goes to Russia, I know, agrees with me? When they're finally there, they come back to say, you were right, it's a fantastic country. How come that we portray this nation as such evil people? And I can only find a spiritual explanation. It's because now Marxism is growing in the West. And they hate anything that is Christian. So they cannot forgive Russia that they rejected, abandoned communism, Marxism, and embraced Orthodox Christian faith. That's why they hate Russia so much, because you can't find any rational explanation. Maybe something with the military industrial complex, they want a war, whatever. That's possibly true. But I think this has a spiritual dimension. They hate Russia because Russia is now becoming a Christian superpower. And that was what I was writing when I came back. This is now an upcoming Christian superpower. So maybe we will see that Christianity will die out in the West and Russia will rise as a huge Christian nation. So, of course, as a journalist and a reporter and a believer, I think this is extremely fascinating to follow because nobody else want to report about it. But I've really had a lot of struggles because nobody wants to believe me. But I'm telling you the truth. It is really fascinating to see, and how they have, I mean, just in Moscow, they're planning over the next 10 years to build 2,000 new churches. That's enormous, just in Moscow. And that's all over Russia. So it's a lot of things are really growing.
Wouldn't you say that, I mean, when you look at Russia and the completely opposite direction Russia has taken pertaining to how the West is heading, we know all the talk about the New World Order, and we're supposed to Mr. Rothschild and all. We hear how, I mean, when you read about these things about unifying everything into one economy, and one is supposed to rule the world and all of that. I mean, Russia is kind of like a thorn in the side.
Exactly.
Because I think a number of people wished for the end of the Christian faith and the end of religion as a whole, really, and a new utopian society, and in which maybe they dreamed of the ultra-rich owning everything and controlling everything. And in that type of picture as well, it must be very annoying that a country like Russia takes that turn, because they're not so easily controllable, to put it that way.
You are spot on. I think it was not part of the plan that Russia should go back to Christianity. And the Russians are very tough, because the Russian people have suffered enormously, also for their faith. So they're very hard to conquer. I mean, nobody has been able to do it. Hitler, Napoleon, nobody could conquer Russia. And if they go to war with Russia, I don't think they're going to win the war, because the Russians, they really are extremely tough, and they have their faith. I mean, materialism doesn't really mean as much to Russians as it does to us, or as it does to us. And I think in case of war, we would be surprised to see what kind of toughness they have. And also during Soviet time, we also have to keep in mind that there was an underground church. I mean, the communists couldn't really kill the faith. There were still a lot of people who were baptized secretly. Putin was one of them. He was baptized without his father's knowledge. And there were many in this generation that got baptized and blessed. So there was an underground church. Whereas in the West, the Marxist influence in universities and education, government, all sorts of entertainment industry, they have been much more successful killing the faith here in the West, because Marxism is a Western philosophy. It's not a Russian idea, and it was something that was imposed on Russia. We have to also to remember that. And now, after Russia abandoned Marxism, it's really gaining new strength in the West. And that's why we are having these totalitarian regimes all over the Western world. It's because our ideology is actually cultural Marxism right now. And with the first coming of Marxism, you had the financial reforms, economical reforms. Now it's about equality. Now, race, gender, religion, culture, everywhere you see we have this kind of absurd idea about equality. It's identity politics today. This is the second coming of Marxism we see in the West, and it's going to be just as totalitarian as it was in the East. And I think the only way to break that is through Christian faith, because there are no political system that is able to go against this Marxist idea in the West. We only have Christian spirituality, and that is also what actually made communism come down in the Soviet Union. It was the Christian faith.
It's very interesting what you're saying, and I can so say that I am one of those who have been to Russia. And it is a wonderful place. I've been on a number of places there and visited the Kremlin and spoken to many leading Russians as well. And I would like to say that you find a humility and a kindness and also a perseverance, and a meekness and a realism. They love realism. They don't particularly enjoy utopianism so much. They're tired of utopian ideologies. I get the feeling they've had enough of that, and they're really anchored in the real world. And thinking about wars and maybe upcoming wars as well, and the concept of never march on Moscow, If you push Scandinavians, they all flip to each side. That's one of the dreams of many of the young men when they speak to each other. Today they say, what if the Russians are coming? Then I will run to the US, you know. But the Russian spirit is a different spirit, and that makes it harder to conquer, because if you push on the Russians, they come together as one. So, and then they go to war, and 40 million lives are lost, and still they come together because they protect, and they see themselves as the protectors of Byzance. This is why you see the double-headed eagle outside of the Russian Foreign Office, and you know, the double-headed eagle is such a symbol. They see when Byzance fell, all the gold. This is what you can see in of course, in, you know, the gold and the silver and all the beauty from Byzance was taken to Moscow. So they see themselves as the protectors of the Christian faith. So I think that.
But what is very important to understand about Russia, if you want to understand the Russians and Russia, is that it's not just a nation, it's a spiritual concept, it's a state of mind. And that's why the Russian Orthodox faith is what is Russian culture. I mean, you can't separate it. And that was why they were so victimized during the Soviet Union, because they were not allowed to practice that faith. And now they're returning to this Orthodox faith. And many people say, oh, Putin, he's just talking about this because it's for his own political purpose. But that's not my impression. I mean, I think he's doing this to follow his people, because he knows that the people is so connected to the Russian Orthodox faith. So it would be completely crazy to suggest a modern Russia without orthodoxy. So what also was interesting for me was that in Russia today, you can be a modern person. You can live a modern life, yet being a traditional Christian, which is not possible anymore in the West. Because if you have traditional Christian values and a traditional Christian lifestyle, there are jobs you can get. I mean, there are circles you would be excluded from. I mean, you will severely punished by the public opinion if you have those opinions. I know myself, because I am a debater and a public person, and I have been talking about my Christian faith in public, and it has really cost me a lot. But in Russia, that's completely normal. You can be a modern person and have all, I mean, the nice things of modern life, and yet be a Christian. And you will have a certain moral foundation. There are things you won't do, and you will have a moral compass to know what is right and what is wrong and what is good and what is evil. And that's why the Russians, I think the reason why the West fears Russia so much is because of this spiritual renewal. It's not because it is a political threat. Because right now, I think if we talk about this from a spiritual perspective, I mean, the West has become satanic or demonic. And the demons always fear Christ and Christianity, because they know this is what it, or they know that this will defeat them, or they will suffer defeat by Christianity. So that's, of course, they're very afraid of Russia. So if you see this kind of hatred against Russia, or people are fearful of Russia, you have to understand it in a spiritual dimension. It's because they actually fear the light that comes from Russia now, because it's becoming a Christian nation, and because we're in the darkness.
Thank you very much, Iben Thranholm, for taking the time to explain your view on Russia and tell us the stories that about what you experienced there. And thank you very much for joining us here at the Herland Report.
Thank you.